Gareth Solwyck thought he had outsmarted the world until Mira Colfax uncovered the one clue that shattered his 45-year secret and exposed one of the longest-running serial killing sprees in American history. In 1978, the small and peaceful town of Vellington, Ohio, found itself shrouded in a nightmare it wasn't prepared for. Life in Vellington had always been quiet, predictable. Families knew each other for generations, children played freely in the streets, and crimes were rare. But that all changed in the summer of that year when 24-year-old Evelyn Mercer disappeared on her way home from her nursing shift at St. Bartholomew's Hospital. Her car was found abandoned on a rural road just outside of town, the driver's side door open, the keys still in the ignition. There was no sign of Evelyn. No struggle, no footprints, no witnesses. A few weeks later, it happened again. This time it was 30-year-old Carla Dernis, a schoolteacher known for her strict but kind nature. She went missing during an early morning jog along the river trail. Her running shoes were discovered neatly placed near a park bench, but there was no trace of her. Panic began to seep into the fabric of Vellington's close-knit community. People started locking their doors. During the day, something they had never done before. Parents refused to let their children out of sight. Rumors spread like wildfire. Some blamed a drifter who had been seen passing through town. Others whispered about a satanic cult or a serial predator hiding in plain sight. By 1981, 8 women had vanished without a trace. The police had no leads, no suspects, and no evidence to work with. The case was labeled the Vellington Vanishings, and it became the dark stain on the town's history. Every detective assigned to the case eventually retired or transferred out, each one leaving behind stacks of unsolved reports and unanswered questions. Over time, the horror of the missing women faded into local legend, something mentioned at campfires or late-night get-togethers, but never truly solved. What no one in Vellington realized was that the killer wasn't a drifter or a stranger. He was a man who had lived among them the entire time. Gareth Solwyck worked quietly as the groundskeeper at Vellington Memorial Cemetery, a job he held for over 15 years. He was considered by most to be a strange but harmless man, known for tending graves with obsessive care and speaking very little to anyone. No one paid attention to Gareth's solitary habits or his late-night visits to the caretaker's shed, where he would often stay for hours after the cemetery gates were locked. Beneath the shed, Gareth had dug out a small hollowed space where he kept his secret. Inside a rusted metal box, he stored the trophies he collected from his victims' small personal items that meant nothing to anyone else but everything to him. Hair ribbons, earrings, watches, and old photographs that captured the last smiles of the women he took. Gareth called it his memory box, and it allowed him to relive his crimes without ever raising suspicion. After the last disappearance in 1981, Gareth suddenly stopped. The reasons were known only to him. Some serial killers stop because they fear getting caught. Others simply lose interest or move on to different methods. For Gareth, it was a combination of both. He met a woman, married her, and moved away from Vellington, leaving his grim collection hidden beneath the cemetery shed. He changed his name, started a new life, and aged into obscurity. To the outside world, he became just another old man, living quietly, with no one suspecting the horrors he had committed decades before. As years turned into decades, Vellington slowly returned to normal. New families moved in, old residents passed away, and the nightmare of the vanishings became a ghost story, fading into the shadows of the past. But deep beneath the floorboards of the forgotten cemetery shed, the evidence of Gareth Solwyck's crimes remained, untouched by time, waiting for the day it would finally be discovered. In the early spring of 2023, Vellington was hit by an unexpected storm. Heavy rain flooded the streets, winds uprooted trees, and lightning strikes lit up the night sky. One bolt struck the old cemetery caretaker's shed, setting the wooden structure ablaze. By morning, the fire had reduced it to a pile of smoldering debris. For most of the town, it was just another piece of forgotten history destroyed by nature. The cemetery itself had been unattended for years, and few people even visited the graves anymore. Weeks later, a local contractor named Liam Verdon was hired by the city council to clear the debris and prepare the land for new landscaping. Liam was a straightforward man, known for his quiet work and attention to detail. On a sunny afternoon, while prying up what remained of the charred floorboards, his crowbar hit something solid beneath the earth. At first, he thought it was just an old toolbox left behind by the previous caretaker. But when he uncovered it fully, he realized the box was wrapped in heavy chains. Its exterior rusted and decayed. Liam called the police immediately, suspecting he'd found something suspicious. The responding officers, expecting perhaps old tools or forgotten cemetery records, were not prepared for what they found when the box was opened. Inside, carefully wrapped in aged cloth and plastic, were small items that instantly set off alarms in the minds of the investigators. There were faded photographs, some Polaroids, showing smiling women in the prime of their lives. There were strands of human hair, tied neatly with colored ribbons. Jewelry rings, necklaces, earrings, each piece carefully tagged with handwritten notes, including dates ranging from 1978 to 1981. Detectives quickly realized the significance of the find. The items matched the descriptions of the personal belongings reported missing alongside the 8 women during the Vellington vanishings. Forensic teams were called in to handle the evidence properly, and soon DNA tests were underway. Advanced forensic technology, which hadn't existed back in the late 70s, now allowed investigators to match the hair and saliva traces on the items to the known DNA profiles of the victims. Every single item in the box was confirmed to belong to one of the missing women. News of the discovery spread quickly. Media outlets from around the country descended on Vellington, broadcasting live reports from the cemetery grounds. The town that had once wanted to forget its darkest chapter was now forced to relive it. The Vellington vanishings were back in the headlines, but this time, there was real evidence and the promise of justice. The state police reopened the case immediately, assigning it to a special cold case division. Among the experts brought in was forensic analyst Mira Colfax, known for her meticulous attention to overlooked details. Mira took possession of the artifacts, studying each item carefully. She noted something peculiar. Every victim had a pair of gloves included in the collection, a brand not commonly found in Ohio. Mira traced the gloves back to a custom manufacturer in Pennsylvania that had long since gone out of business. Fortunately, the company's old order records were archived at a local historical society. Within those dusty records, Mira found a single customer who had ordered multiple pairs of the exact gloves in the late 1970s. The name listed was Gareth Solwyck. Her heart raced as she processed the information. Solwyck wasn't a name that had come up in the original case files. A search into public records showed that Gareth had left Vellington in 1982 and vanished from the grid. Further digging revealed he had legally changed his name after moving to Vermont, where he had lived quietly for decades. What Mira Colfax didn't know yet was that the discovery of the box had not only reopened the case, but also disturbed the long-settled dust over a much larger nightmare. Gareth Solwyck's secret was no longer safe, and the walls around his forgotten crimes were beginning to crumble. Mira Colfax continued her investigation with relentless focus. She knew that Gareth Solwyck was more than just a possible suspect. He was now the central thread connecting all 8 victims from the Vellington vanishings. But something about the timeline bothered her. Why did the murders stop so suddenly in 1981? Serial killers rarely just walk away from their crimes. Mira suspected there was more to Gareth's story than the evidence revealed so far. she started digging into his life after Vellington. Public records showed that Gareth had changed his name legally in 1982, using a loophole in Vermont's outdated registry system. Under his new identity, he had lived a seemingly normal life for more than 40 years. He owned a modest home in the quiet town of Belcaster, Vermont, where he worked as a part-time gardener for a local estate. Neighbors described him as a soft-spoken old man who mostly kept to himself. None of them knew about his past in Ohio, and no one suspected that he had once been at the center of one of the Midwest's most haunting mysteries. While reviewing missing persons reports in the areas Gareth had lived after Vellington, Mira found a troubling pattern. His second wife, Elira Brandt, had vanished in 1994 without leaving any trace behind. The report filed at the time was minimal, just a missing person notice with no follow-up. There were no witnesses, no signs of foul play, and no body was ever found. Gareth had told authorities that Elira left him suddenly after an argument, taking her belongings and disappearing into the night. The case had gone cold and was eventually closed without resolution. Mira's instincts told her that Elira's disappearance wasn't random. She suspected Gareth had continued his pattern of violence, but had become smarter about hiding the evidence. If he had killed Elira, it meant his crime stretched beyond the Vellington vanishings and likely involved more victims. She reached out to Vermont State Police and requested a quiet investigation into Gareth's property, careful not to alert him. It was essential to gather more proof before making any arrests. A covert search warrant was issued. Forensic teams entered Gareth's current residence under the guise of utility maintenance. Inside his modest home, they found nothing unusual at first glance. But in the backyard, beneath a weathered tool shed, officers discovered a hidden crawlspace, covered by loose wooden panels and dirt. What lay beneath confirmed Mira's worst fears. Wrapped in plastic tarps were human remains, later identified as the skeleton of Elira Brandt. Next to her were the remains of an unidentified woman, estimated to have died in the early 2000s. The state of the bones suggested careful preservation, likely buried and exhumed multiple times before being placed in the crawlspace. Gareth had continued his deadly pattern long after leaving Vellington. He had simply evolved, learning how to keep his crimes invisible. DNA evidence tied both bodies to Gareth's property, leaving no room for doubt. Mira expanded the search, combing through missing persons reports in Vermont, New Hampshire, and New York from the past 4 decades. A disturbing trend emerged. Women had gone missing in towns where Gareth had briefly worked or traveled. He had kept moving, staying just long enough to find his next victim, then disappearing again before raising suspicion. Mira realized that Gareth Solwyck wasn't just a local predator. He was a serial killer who had slipped through the cracks of multiple police jurisdictions for over 45 years. He was a man who had lived 2 lives, one as a quiet gardener and neighbor, the other as a predator hiding in plain sight. The artifacts in the cemetery box were only the beginning. The true extent of his crimes was much larger than anyone could have imagined. As Mira assembled the pieces of the puzzle, she prepared for the next phase, bringing Gareth to justice. But she knew this case would shake the foundations of law enforcement. The fact that someone could commit so many crimes across decades and evade capture raised serious questions about how serial killers operate when they aren't looking for fame or attention. Gareth Solwyck had mastered the art of vanishing in plain sight, but now his secrets were beginning to unravel. The decision was made not to arrest Gareth Solwyck immediately. Investigators knew they needed to proceed with caution. Gareth was 78 years old, but his history showed he was meticulous, careful, and capable of hiding evidence. If they moved too quickly, they risked losing the chance to uncover the full extent of his crimes. The investigative team, led by Mira Colfax, decided to observe him first, hoping to learn more about his behavior, patterns, and possible connections to other unsolved cases. surveillance teams were quietly stationed around Gareth's modest Vermont home. Days turned into weeks as they monitored his every move. Gareth followed a routine that seemed painfully ordinary. He tended his small vegetable garden in the mornings, walked to the local library twice a week, and spent afternoons watching birds from his porch. To any passerby, he looked like a harmless elderly man living out his retirement in peace. But Mira knew better. Monsters rarely looked like monsters on the surface. While Gareth went about his daily routine, investigators conducted deeper searches into his past. They contacted small-town police departments across multiple states, searching for patterns that had been missed over the decades. A clearer picture began to emerge. Disappearances had occurred near places where Gareth had briefly worked or lived, small towns, isolated communities, places where his presence was temporary and easily forgotten. The team also began examining the trophies found in the cemetery box more closely. One pair of earrings was traced back to a missing woman from Pennsylvania in 1985, a case long thought to be unrelated to the Vellington vanishings. Another piece of jewelry belonged to a woman reported missing from upstate New York in 1999. These findings confirmed Mira's growing theory. Gareth had never really stopped killing. He had simply become smarter at hiding his victims and more selective about where he struck. With enough evidence in hand to prove Gareth's involvement in multiple murders, the team faced a difficult question: how to confront him without triggering panic or leading him to destroy any remaining proof. Mira wanted more than just an arrest. She wanted a confession, or, at the very least, a reaction that would confirm their findings and possibly lead to the discovery of more victims. A plan was set in motion. Using Gareth's love for routine and his interest in gardening, the police organized a community event under the guise of a Senior Citizens Environmental Award ceremony. The event was held at a local park, and Gareth was invited as an honored guest for his years of volunteer work planting trees and maintaining gardens in the area. To Gareth, it must have seemed like a harmless afternoon, a celebration of his quiet life. He arrived at the event dressed in his usual plain clothes, smiling politely at the organizers. The cameras, hidden among the crowd, captured every moment. The key moment came when Gareth was handed a special plaque meant to commemorate his contributions. On the surface, it looked like a simple thank you gift. But when Gareth flipped the plaque over to examine the back, his expression changed. Engraved on the reverse side were the names of all 8 women from the Vellington vanishings, followed by the names of Elira Brandt and the unidentified woman from the crawlspace beneath his shed. The list continued with the names of other suspected victims connected to him. Through the jewelry and evidence collected over the last several months, for the first time in 45 years, Gareth Solwyck's carefully constructed facade cracked. His hands trembled slightly. His jaw stiffened. His eyes darted across the crowd, searching for an escape route, but there was none. Undercover officers were already surrounding him, waiting for Mira's signal. The moment had come. Gareth realized he had been caught, not just for the crimes in Vellington, but for a lifetime of hidden murders. The trap of time had finally closed around him, and there was nowhere left to run. Gareth Solwyck was arrested on the spot as cameras rolled, capturing the moment his decades-long secret came crashing down. The image of him standing frozen, clutching the engraved plaque, became the face of breaking news across the country. For the residents of Vellington and the families of the missing women, it was a moment of long-awaited justice. But for the investigative team, it was only the beginning of the next phase, a complex process of uncovering the full scope of Gareth's crimes. In custody, Gareth refused to speak. He remained calm, almost eerily detached, as officers transported him to a secure facility. For days he sat silently in his cell, eyes closed, refusing to answer questions. His lawyers advised him to say nothing, but the investigators already had overwhelming evidence. The DNA matches the artifacts from the cemetery, the remains found beneath his Vermont shed, and the timeline of disappearances were enough to ensure a conviction. Still, Mira Colfax and her team knew there were more victims whose names they didn't yet know, whose families were still waiting for answers. Forensic teams began the meticulous task of searching every property Gareth had ever lived in, worked at, or visited. Cadaver dogs were brought in, ground-penetrating radar was used in various backyards, and old storage units were inspected. What they found stunned even the most experienced detectives. In a rented storage unit 2 towns away from Gareth's Vermont home, investigators uncovered boxes filled with disturbing memorabilia, journals, maps with coded markings, and more personal items belonging to women who had vanished over the years. Gareth had documented his crimes in chilling detail. The journals contained lists of dates, victim descriptions, and cryptic notes about disposal locations. The investigation stretched into a nationwide manhunt, not for Gareth himself, but for his past. Authorities began connecting cold cases from Ohio, Pennsylvania, Vermont, New York, and even parts of Canada. Women who had disappeared between 1978 and 2010, many of whom had been classified as runaways or cases without foul play evidence, were now being re-examined under a new lens. Gareth's journals included initials and locations that helped identify at least 10 more victims beyond those already known. One of the most haunting revelations came from a section of Gareth's writings labeled "The Mistakes." These notes described women who had escaped him or victims he had planned to abduct, but didn't due to last-minute changes. Some of these near victims were still alive, now in their 60s and 70s, living quiet lives, unaware that they had once been inches away from becoming part of his collection. When contacted by authorities, they described brief encounters with a man matching Gareth's description decades earlier, an unsettling coincidence that now made terrifying sense. As Gareth's trial approached, the case drew international attention. Psychologists, criminologists, and law enforcement agencies studied his patterns, trying to understand how a killer could operate so long without detection. Unlike many serial killers who craved attention or made mistakes that led to capture, Gareth had been methodical. He moved frequently, chose isolated victims, and left little physical evidence until technology caught up to him decades later. In court, Gareth remained expressionless. He declined to testify, offering no confession and no apology. But his silence was irrelevant. The evidence spoke louder than any words could. He was convicted on multiple counts of first-degree murder, with additional charges still pending. As more cases were connected to him, the judge sentenced him to life without the possibility of parole, knowing that even a death sentence would not balance the scales of his crimes. For the families of the victims, the trial brought a mix of closure and heartbreak. Answers had finally come, but so had the grim realization of how long justice had taken. Gareth Solwyck's reign of terror was over, but the scars he left behind would remain. His case became a permanent reminder of how evil can hide in plain sight, sometimes for nearly half a century, before finally being unmasked.